Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Kevin Navratil, and I am a political science professor at Moraine Valley. I'm also the Democracy Commitment Coordinator. In this semester, we've been hosting a series of events on the 2020 election, and this is our final event where we are going to answer any questions that you may have about the 2020 election and talk about some of the implications of the 2020 election, some of the potential changes we could see on domestic and foreign policy making. I'm joined with my rock star colleague, Merri Fefles-Dunkle. She is a political science, history, and sociology professor. So thank you for joining me today, Merri.
Good morning, Kevin. My pleasure to be here with you again. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Merri and I have talked a little bit about how we might want to approach this, and it's been quite a week. It's been a very eventful election with, I know, a lot of late nights by at least myself of watching the returns come in and trying to follow the presidential race in particular. We're having an election during the pandemic, so that has made things a little bit more difficult than normal. So we planned on covering some of the implications and key takeaways, but we thought we'd give an opportunity for you, the participant, to ask any questions via the chat function. If you type out any question or aspect that you would like us to cover today, that way we make sure that we make it relevant to you. This is a unique situation where we don't have a specific class attending this session, and it's just open to the public. And so I definitely want to make it relevant to our audience. So please let us know if there's anything in particular that you would like us to touch upon in our time today. And we would be happy to talk about that. But until we get some questions, I thought I would start off with showing a few results from the 2020 election. So bear with me here just a second. Okay, so first of all, this election is unique in a lot of ways, one of which we had a pandemic. We're in the middle of a pandemic. So we have had mail-in voting, absentee voting for over 100 years. Some states, especially out west, use it exclusively. However, many more states adopted it on a much larger scale in this election. And so because of that, and many people predicted this would happen, not all the votes would be counted on election night. Just the sheer scale and volume of number of absentee ballots for states to collect, some of which states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin were prohibited from starting their vote collection where they could start tabulating the results of their mail-in ballots that arrived early until election day. So it's really kind of a unique situation where ballots, depending upon the state that you live in, can still be accepted as long as they were postmarked by election day in places like Illinois for up for 2 weeks until after the election. So that made it a little difficult for, many people predicted that this would happen as far as there being like a red mirage in a few of these battleground states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, where some of the votes that were made in person might get counted first, and every state reports their results differently as far as whether they count the mail-in ballots first or in-person voting first. And so it looked like, the early returns were favoring Donald Trump in some of these early states on election night. And obviously that has changed since then to where the major media outlets have at least called Pennsylvania for Joe Biden, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, giving currently at least 279 electoral college votes for Joseph Biden, making him the president-elect. There are a few states that have been yet to be called officially by multiple outlets, at least, and that is Georgia, where Joe Biden has a small, about 12,000 vote lead. North Carolina, that is a bigger lead for Donald Trump, that should be called soon. And then Arizona, that is a fairly small lead for Joseph Biden. So trying to share my screen here and to try to show you what the electoral college votes will likely look like when this is all said and done. And that is that Biden will have 306, which happens to be the exact same number of votes that Donald Trump had electoral votes in 2016. So this is what the map should look like based on our expectations. And when all the final votes are certified in the various states. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I don't see any questions yet. So what I was going to do is, before I turn it over to Merri, is just talk about some of the key takeaways that I had from this election. All right, so first of all, I think one of the big winners in this election was voter turnout. Citizens did a great job of showing up to vote. This is really impressive considering we're living in a pandemic. It looks like we're going to set a record for voter turnout in the last 120 years. Really since 1900, I think we're about 67% voter turnout. So that's really impressive. I think that both parties can find something to be happy with, to be or disappointed with the results. You know, as we're looking now, Democrats have won the presidency. They're going to maintain the House of Representatives majority, but Democrats lost at least 5, 10, to maybe even up to 15 seats, depending upon some of these close elections in the way that they go. Republicans have a minimum of 50 Senate seats and potentially 2 more. One of the questions we already received was, in Georgia, if no candidate receives a majority in the general election, then they have a runoff election with the top 2 candidates. So I want to say January 5th, there's a runoff election between the top 2. So there happens to be 2 separate elections for both of the Senate seats in Georgia on January 5th. I want to say between Kelly Loeffler and John Ossoff, and then Raphael Warnock and David Perdue, in the other seat. And so it's possible that Democrats win one or both of those seats, or I would, at this point, put Republicans probably in a slight advantage for maintaining those 2 seats. So Republicans could win 52 seats in the Senate, but at a minimum have 50 seats. And that's where we're sitting with the Senate. And I'd also point out that Republicans did really well at the state level. I think they will have, if you look at state legislatures, which happen to create the congressional districts for the next 10 years, because this is a census year, we'll have new congressional districts for the 2022 elections up and through the 2030 elections. And Republicans will have a hand, will be able to control the map making in 4 times as many states as Democrats. I think there was another point I'd like to make is that this was a key historical moment for Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Amazing moment to have the first woman as vice president, a lot of firsts with her, first African-American, first Asian, multiracial candidate. And I think that's awesome for a lot of different reasons, for people to look to her as somebody who reflects America. And I'd also point out that a major takeaway for me in this election is just how divided we are as a country. Very impressed with the voter turnout of being a record high in the last 120 years. But there weren't a lot of people who I think were open-minded to the other party or other candidate. I think people were pretty partisan in how they decided this election. And I worry about that growing division. In fact, Donald Trump hasn't conceded this election. I refer to Biden as president-elect because he does have the majority of the Electoral College votes, but major Republican leaders, including Mitch McConnell, have failed to acknowledge Biden as president-elect. And I'm just kind of worried about this growing partisan divide that our new government and Joe Biden and the Republican Senate and Democratic House is going to inherit. So in light of that, what I wanted to talk about just a little bit is the consequences of having divided government. And so we're looking at a Democratic president, a Republican Senate, and a very narrow Democratic House. And so that means as citizens, I think we need to be very educated and informed on the way our system works with separation of powers and checks and balances. Many of the maybe more visionary or idealistic campaign ideas and platform of Joe Biden might not be realistic. Some Democrats, I think, really were interested in a more progressive agenda of let's say a green New Deal, maybe changing the filibuster, or massive kind of new stimulus program to help the economy, potentially adding new states like Puerto Rico. And really, with a Republican Senate, all of that is at least either off the table or, when it comes to a stimulus, is probably going to be much more modest. And so I think we have to understand that just because Biden is the president doesn't mean he's going to get exactly everything that he wants. I also think that Biden is unique. One of the takeaways that I have from this election is that he has failed to win the nomination of his. He's run for president 3 times. In 2 previous times, in 2 different decades, he failed to win the nomination, and it was actually like pretty poor showing, right? I mean, he dropped out pretty quickly into both of his previous election runs. And so it's kind of interesting in that I feel like I'm more of I guess the way that I look at elections, a lot of times I think it's important to understand the moment that we're in. And I think that in 2020, Joe Biden finally met the right moment for his candidacy to work. And he is a statesman. He has served for almost 4 decades in the Senate. He had served 8 years as a vice president. He's known to be a very decent and good person, and I think you can go across the line of people who have worked with him, between Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, John McCain. Other people have served with him in the Senate for decades who have always had positive things to say about him. And it just may be that that's kind of what Democrats or America was looking for at this moment in time, of having somebody with his kind of gravitas and decorum and decency. And so I think he kind of found the right moment. In speaking back to whether he can get his initiative done, I just kind of laid out some of the challenges that he's going to have with facing a Republican Senate. But maybe one of the benefits for having him as the president for Democrats is that he has all of this background and experience in the Senate. He has close relationships with Mitch McConnell. When he was vice president under the Obama administration, he was frequently the kind of go-to person when there was the last-minute negotiations between Republicans and Democrats. Mitch McConnell would often say, "Get Joe on the phone," because he knew Joe would kind of get down to the details and let speak freely on where Democrats were able really tackle the big problems that we're facing. You know, there's no shortage of major issues that we are facing as a country. Obviously, a pandemic with rising cases by the day, an economy that has lost a lot of jobs, where a lot of people are really hurting to make ends meet. You know, there's a lot of racial tension, a lot of conflict domestically, I think, between people and their different visions of what America should be. And I just hope that our new Senate, new House, new president, all work together in the spirit of cooperation and not looking to the next election, looking for their narrow kind of self-preservation interests and looking out for the American interests. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Fefles and look forward to taking any questions and comments that you have later.
Thank you, sir. And we do actually have a question that came over about Donald Trump having a case in court. If you don't mind, though, I was going to piggyback off a point you made, a very good point, Kevin, about this sort of being Joe Biden's moment. You know, him having run multiple times in 1988 and not being successful. For those of students who don't know about his background, Joe Biden's had his experience with loss and grief that I think kind of groomed him for this moment. He lost when he first won as senator in Delaware. His wife and his 2 sons and his daughter were in a car accident, horrible car accident, in which his wife and daughter were killed. And so he was sworn in as senator of the state in the hospital with his 2 boys next to him. And then, of course, about 5 years ago, he lost his son, Beau, to cancer, to brain cancer. So I think he's able to express an empathy in dealing with, especially since we've endured so much loss in this country. We're approaching, what's the number now of coronavirus? Which I'm sorry, I should know that number by heart right now, but it's too high, whatever it is at the moment. I think even in Illinois, we had 10,000 cases, and the rates of death are starting to go up again, unfortunately, as the ICU rates are going up as well. So I think that he's kind of one of those men that's well suited for the moment, in that he's been through something that allows him to, I think, empathize with people in a way that maybe other past presidents have not been able to. And I think people feel kind of a sense of comfort with that. Anyway, that's just a side note. But the question about Donald Trump having a case in court, and Kevin, feel free, we could jump back and forth and on that too. Do you mind if I share my my presentation? Am I able to? I think I have to be enabled to be able to share it. Awesome. Thank you, sir. File, I'll do the file. Okay, desktop. Give me 1 second here, folks. We always have a little technical difficulties. There we go. Continue. Okay. Are you able to see that, Kevin? Can you see it?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. And like I said, Kevin, feel free, please, to jump in on this. I just had a couple slides that I put together. And as Kevin already beautifully went through it, I just want to jump in on a couple different things. Yeah, the turnout that you talked about was unbelievable. You've already mentioned a lot of this stuff about the absentee ballots. And I think that's one thing that there's been a lot of confusion that's been sown, that people have not understood because of some of the misinformation that's been coming out. The idea that people, why are there so many, I heard students say, well, why are there so many ballots being counted now? Like, well, why is the number changing? Well, that's because, again, that mail-in ballots in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan were not being counted before. They started being counted on election night, which therefore made that counting rather slow. We're still counting in Georgia. We still don't have a tally in Georgia or North Carolina. Now, where things get muddled, though, is that the Trump campaign now is saying that there has been fraud, but we have yet to see any proof of that fraud. And so the question from Ronisha that's been put out here is about Donald Trump having a case in court. There has to be some kind of proof that there has been an issue. And there's some couple things I wanted to go over. So in places like Philadelphia, where there were allegations being made that the ballots were being thrown out or not counted or whatever it might be, there were surveillance cameras. You could watch on a live stream these ballots being counted. So the idea that it was just so easy to just kind of commit fraud it's simply not true. It's very, very difficult to commit fraud. Now, mistakes happen. There's a difference between mistakes and between fraud. We are at and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, I think the statistic is about 0.00004 to 0.00008 of election so-called fraud, and it's usually come down to like mistakes that have happened. The person may have died in between the time that a ballot was mailed to the time that the election occurred. And so most times it is an accident. It's not an actual deliberate case of fraud. But when you're alleging the fraud, though, it's kind of freaking people out. And I've included a link on here that I'm happy to actually put on the chat as well for people to look at from the Brennan Center that talks about the kind of debunking some of these different, this is before this election, going back further of why this is just simply not the case. So again, fraud is one thing, a mistake is one thing, fraud is an entirely different thing. The other thing I think that's been really interesting, a takeaway that I would take to add to what Kevin was saying is how I've enjoyed seeing just civil servants, just simple kind of civil servants on the local, on the state level, Democrats and Republicans alike, kind of working together and coming out and saying, no, we stand by our voting. We stand by our tally. There is integrity in this process. There's no fraud taking place here. And I just saw, like, I've included a quote in here that came up in the Washington Post yesterday. I'm sorry, it should say the 9th. It should say 11/9/20, not 11/10. That the Secretary of State in Georgia, who is a Republican, is being called to resign over his failure to, quote, deliver an honest and transparent election. And he's taking obviously umbrage with that, saying that this election has been delivered quite honestly and that he refuses to resign. And similar allegations are being made in other states as well. So this idea that in Arizona as well, where these are also Republican secretaries of state or Republican local election officials who are saying there's nothing going on. So when you have crowds outside the building saying count the votes, well, they're counting the votes. That's what they were doing inside these ballot places. They're counting the votes. And part of the problem, I think, is that, it seems to be that in some cases, so if we're saying in Pennsylvania, we're saying that we want the votes to be stopped, but then in Arizona, we're saying to count the votes, there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy in what is being asked for. So there have been a few Republicans who have come out and said that Trump needs to concede the election. Now, in order for there to be President-elect Biden has been acting as though this transition is taking place. But in order for it to be, let's say, legit, so to speak, President Trump does not necessarily have to concede, but the General Services Administration in the executive branch has got to authorize it and say, okay, we can proceed with this. He can go ahead and this transition can now start to take place so that Trump administration officials and Biden administration officials can start talking to one another. But that's not yet happened. So you've had some prominent Republicans like Mitt Romney of Utah and Ben Sasse of Nebraska who've come out and have congratulated Joe Biden as being president, and some former Republican congressmen. But as Kevin also pointed out, as Professor Navratil pointed out, Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, has not yet done so. And Lindsey Graham, who was kind of silent the first couple of days, is now coming on full force saying that, if these results are not challenged, Republicans will never win an election again. But again, the facts don't seem to really match up with what's being said. The one discrepancy that seems to keep emerging is that why is there no challenge then to these victories in the U.S. Senate then? Why are there only challenges to the presidency? So it's okay for the U.S. media then to call, let's say, an election for the presidency and say, okay, there's enough electoral votes to determine that Joe Biden is the winner of the presidency. Then doesn't that call into question some of these senatorial races as well? And there's been no talk of that. In the case of President Trump, he got more votes this time than he got last time. So if there's like widespread fraud, how is that the case? Something else that came up yesterday that I did see that is being alleged, and again, I'm sorry, yesterday, apparently I thought that yesterday was November 10th. I'm sorry, today is November 10th. I kept claiming that my articles were from November 10th, they were from November 9th. But talking about this idea of undervoting, that one of the allegations that's being made is that these votes must be wrong because only the president's name is being filled out in the ballot and nobody else. Well, I'll tell you all that when I was first voting in Illinois, and I didn't know who the heck I was voting for as a young, like 18-year-old voter, I would just vote for, let's say, the governor, and I had no idea who else I was voting for. So I would vote for maybe the governor and maybe my congressman, and that was it. I wouldn't vote for any of the judges or anything because I didn't know. So I would turn in a largely empty ballot. And I remember, the election officials would say, okay, you're missing there's some missing things on here. Are you sure you want to turn it in as it is? And I'd say, yes, I'm good. And they would just take it and turn it in. So this idea of undervoting is normal. It does not mean that's fraud. It just means that some people just will vote only for the president and not vote for other senators or other offices. Again, in terms of the proof being, like, where is this proof? So far, there have been lots of allegations made, but there's not yet been any actual substantial proof being made. And the senator from Pennsylvania, is that not Toomey? Is it Toomey? Kevin, I'm having a brain burp. Yeah, was saying just yesterday that, okay, or on Face the Nation on Sunday, that okay, if there is proof, he didn't come out and congratulate Joe Biden, but he does seem to be saying that Joe Biden has apparently won. But if there is proof, then that proof needs to be given, and then we can go from there. So, and to answer this long-winded answer to your question, Renisha, I'm sorry, is that in terms of court options, there don't seem to be very many at the moment because there really is no proof being offered. So whatever cases had been brought before the courts in a couple different states, they've been essentially thrown out. Now, Justice Samuel Alito, who is the presiding justice from the Supreme Court in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area there, did issue a decree, so to speak, saying that Pennsylvania had to separate the ballots that were coming in after Election Day, but that was already being done. But that's been the only talk so far that the Supreme Court has made. I would venture to say that the Supreme Court is not going to want to say too much about this idea of intervening in this election, because they did once in 2000, and that was seen as kind of a lightning rod moment for the Supreme Court, where the court has become quite politicized. And since then, as it's been difficult to depoliticize it since that has happened. And not to mention, when that did happen, they said this is a one-off. In other words, when they issued that decree, or they issued their ruling in Bush v. Gore in 2000, they said, okay, this is not precedent. We're not issuing this ruling so that afterwards you can go ahead and use this for political precedent later on. We're just issuing this ruling now, and that's it. So I would venture to say that there's not much in terms of options for the court. I think this is more of a delay tactic and more kind of a PR stunt to kind of get Trump sort of comfortable with the idea that, it's time to maybe, turn it in. And he doesn't like to, no one likes to lose, right? Nobody likes to. But he definitely is a person that has demonstrated that he does not like to lose. So he's not yet quite at that point where he's ready to concede. So I do also have slides about foreign policy, but do you want to hold off on that, Kevin, in case you want to jump in?
Sure. Let's. Excuse me, I have a cold. Excellent point on the. Excuse me. On the Supreme Court and on the court cases, and I would just kind of echo what Merri pointed out. And really, there isn't any path for President Trump to somehow get to 270 votes, electoral college votes. Any of his, Merri did a good job pointing out there really isn't any evidence of large-scale voter fraud, and it isn't systematic in any way. I mean, we have Republican Secretary of States, Republican governors in places like Georgia and Arizona. So, there isn't any systemic pattern of irregularities. And I think if you know his playbook is to cast doubt. And, he was asked before 2016 whether he would abide by the election results, and he said he wouldn't commit to it. And in 2020, he said, we'll have to see. I'll have to see what depend upon what I see. And so in 2016, in one of I think it was the Iowa contest that Ted Cruz may have won, where he said that, there was fraud and we needed the results weren't valid. And so it's kind of his game, so to speak, is to question the legitimacy of elections. And frankly, I find that just repulsive. Our elections are a bedrock foundation of our political system. And as Merri pointed out, it's really tireless work by civil servants across the political aisle who engage in counting the votes. And it was very transparent. And as she pointed out, I mean, this was a really good election for Republicans in a lot of ways. I mean, the total voter turnout across the board, I want to say that Republicans won 29 of the 30 most competitive seats, House seats, according to Nate Silver, that were the most competitive for this election cycle. They did an outstanding job. I mean, Senate races, Democrats poured $100 million into the Senate race in Kentucky, $100 million into the race in South Carolina, and they lost by 25 and 10% in those two states. Millions of dollars in Maine, and Susan Collins won by 10%. I mean, Republicans did really, really well across the board. I also wanted to point out, this is just kind of taking on one of the questions I noticed in the chat, that excellent observation that, across the states, there was various referendum where citizens get to weigh in on specific issues. And whether it was in Florida on minimum wage, $15 an hour being approved, or tax on millionaires in Arizona, or the various legalization of recreational or medical marijuana being passed across the board in every situation that it was on the ballot, does show that there was some support for more progressive issues, if you will. But on the flip side, Democrats really kind of took a beating in many House races, and many competitive Senate seats ended up not being very competitive. And ultimately, Democrats flipped Colorado and they flipped Arizona. But Merri, am I missing any Senate seats? Yeah. So, there really wasn't the blue wave that I think some of the polls had pointed to, of being a major kind of moment for the Democratic Party to not just win. I mean, at the national level, I think the presidency, that was a pretty strong win for Democrats. But down ballot, it just really didn't translate. And in places like Texas and Florida, there's really, really strong Republican turnout, and they did very well in House of Representative races, and also at state level races that are really key in making a lot of local decision making for citizens. I see a question, Merri, and I don't know if you want to start with this. If there's no voter fraud found, what actions will occur if President Trump refuses to have a peaceful transfer of power?
Right, and I'm also seeing, are we seeing like different, because I also see in the chat for one of my students about what happens if Trump does not concede. So I think essentially we're kind of on the same wavelength. So there's no precedent for this, because this has never happened before. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that a political opponent the loser in the election has to concede. It's something that has happened just by precedent over the years, it's been by tradition. So that's whether he does or does not. I think that it's until the GSA goes ahead and authorizes this transition, we're kind of in limbo. But if you're asking in terms of what happens if he doesn't concede, by Inauguration Day, I don't think it's going to go that far. I think that I think it's at a certain point when it seems like these legal options have all been exhausted. And I'm sorry, my dog is a little psychotic. She's out here with me. She's trying to eat my deck, so it's she's a little crazy in the background. So if these legal options are all exhausted, it's going to be a little bit difficult to kind of keep sustaining this. Now, the damage, I would say, has been done in terms of kind of convincing many of Trump's followers that this has been, this is all an illegitimate election, and this is all fraudulent, and not to accept the results. But in terms of whether or not it will be accepted, I think eventually he will have to concede. The question is, how long is it going to take him to do so? And whether or not will the GSA just go ahead and authorize the transition, whether he concedes or not. And she's a Trump appointee. So, I mean, it doesn't mean she's in a very difficult position, but there have already been some op-eds written saying, listen, you do what you have to do. Like, it's it's, whether he appointed you or not, you do what you have to do. So I would argue that he will concede. And I don't think it's going to come to, him holding onto the door of the Oval Office and him having to pry his fingers off. I certainly hope that's not the case, but I think it will end earlier than that.
Yeah, I don't really know his full game plan, and I mean we're in speculation
there is
mode.
one.
Yeah, but I don't hear him giving a concession speech. I don't envision that. But I also, like Merri pointed out, I don't see him, being removed by the Secret Service either. But just to point out, the election results are not going to be overturned. The votes in Pennsylvania are there for Biden. They will likely be there in Arizona, though Biden doesn't need it. They are likely there in Georgia. Again, Biden doesn't need it. But Michigan, there's like 150,000 vote lead for Joe Biden. And Wisconsin, there's like a 20,000 vote lead. And there likely could be a recount there if Trump decides to pay for it. But recounts typically result in a few hundred vote changes, not thousands, like 20,000. That's not going to happen. So there's just really, and as far as these court cases, it's again, it's going to sow doubt, and it's going to make us confused, and going to make us think, if you're a really partisan Democrat or partisan Republican, you're going to, filter this in your own way, I guess. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of this is just to make the system look bad. And that's unfortunate because the results are going to hold up, and he doesn't have a path to the presidency. I think there's a couple things going on here, and I've mentioned this before, but one of the things, it's just norms. The norms are being violated, and we've relied on them. They're not etched in law, but, there's pictures, you can see them of Barack Obama hosting Trump in the White House. Hillary Clinton giving a concession speech the next day. And of course that, just popular vote aside, much larger victory than even in 2016. And an electoral college vote is going to be the same electoral college vote victory that Trump had. So this really isn't in question. If you look at the data, if you look at the trends of the states, the remaining ballots are likely going to lean Democrat in the states that are still collecting ballots. There's a possibility that Trump picks up some more votes in Arizona, but I think the large part of this, there's two things that could be going on, and there's some speculation that part of this is a play on those two Senate seats in Georgia, that this is a way to fire up the Republican base, keep them engaged in the process, make sure that more Republicans will turn out in Georgia, because, even though Republicans currently have 50 senators, if it's a 50-50 tie in the Senate, then Kamala Harris would be the tie-breaking vote on any bill that or vote that came to 50-50. So Republicans would love to have the actual majority so that Mitch McConnell could remain the Senate Majority Leader. So in some ways, this is a proxy war over that Senate races in Georgia. But I would also just lastly point out that the transition team of Joe Biden is being hurt by this, because as Merri pointed out, they're not going to get the resources, some of the briefings, and you need to hit the ground running when you're inaugurated, and we're facing big problems with not only the pandemic, with the economy. There's national security issues with China and Russia and Iran and so many others, North Korea. It's in 2000 when we had a fairly contested election that ultimately didn't get resolved until December. The 9/11 Commission cited that part of the reason that the Bush administration wasn't fully prepared for 9/11, which of course happened in September 11th, 2001, when the Bush administration took office in January of 2001, is that transition team wasn't it took too long for them to be transitioning. They weren't able to be briefed fully during that timeline. And so this isn't, you don't want to handicap the new government. We're already facing a recession, pandemic, a lot of issues. So I think it's irresponsible to pursue this any longer.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I'd also echo, I just, this morning, of course I had it open and now it's, where to go here? From NBC News just this morning, and it's not just on there, but that William Barr has issued, the Attorney General issued a memo authorizing prosecutors to go ahead and pursue substantial allegations of voting and vote tabulation irregularities. And as a result of that, the director of the election crimes branch of the Department of Justice resigned. Basically, saying that his resignation was linked to that memo, the idea that there is not this fraud that's taking place, and has resigned as a result. So it just seems that the longer this is dragged out, and the more that we delegitimize this election, it's doing nobody any favors, especially in the middle of a pandemic, with our economy being in the state that it's in. There are pressing foreign policy issues that we haven't even addressed yet that also have to be addressed. So I mean, and that was a prime example of 9/11. So I mean, I think you could argue this is like a 9/11 plus a financial crisis rolled up into one, what we're facing right now. So this just doesn't seem to be helping us. Are there other questions on your end, Kev? Because I don't see anything else in the chat.
I don't see any. I just want to remind, if anybody came in late, we were trying to make this relevant to whatever you're interested in, anything that you want us to address. So please use the chat function to type in any questions or comments, reactions, thoughts that you had on the 2020 election. We still have 30 minutes. I know Merri was going to talk about some of the foreign policy implications, but we can come back to any questions that may pop up.
Right, yeah. Jocelyn just had a question, and I'm going to defer to you on this one, Kevin, because we were talking about it in my class last time. I was supposed to give you guys an answer. What happens with the dead representative that was elected in North Dakota? And do you have an answer to that one, Kevin? I was supposed to look that up and I forgot to look that up, and I'm sorry.
The reason why
it's up to the state to determine kind of how that seat's filled.
Right. The reason why we struggle answering these questions is because it varies by state. And I, off the top of my head, don't know how the state of North Dakota handles this. Sometimes there's special elections. Other times governors can appoint somebody, but in this case, it seems to be special election threshold, considering how quickly, the person passed before the election was even took place. So I don't have a definitive answer on that, because it typically varies by state. So it's hard to know, unless you live in that state, what the various rules are.
That's essentially what I said.
But it's a great question.
It is a good question.
I also could have pointed out there was a question about the fair tax, which I think is a really consequential policy issue that failed. So if you live in Illinois, you know that we have a flat tax system where everybody's taxed the same percentage. And there was a proposal to change our amendment, or change the Constitution to allow for the state of Illinois to basically have a higher tax rate for those with higher incomes. And 60% of the voters needed to support that. And unfortunately, I think they only got to about 45%. And I say unfortunately because I think it was something that was necessary for, first of all, we have a major revenue issue in Illinois. And secondly, we're one of the few states that still has a flat tax system. Most states do treat tax income earners differently based on how much money they make, just like we do at the national level, where people who make more money generally have more money to give than lower income individuals. So I think that that's going to be a big problem for the state of Illinois to deal with our budget issues. So now, and I think that's one of the messaging issues. People, a lot of friends and family members would talk to me about this and say, oh, well, can't they raise our taxes for everybody later? And yeah, they can, but what people didn't fully comprehend with this is Democrats have the governor's seat. They have a majority in the House and in the Illinois Senate, so they could raise everybody's taxes right now or yesterday or a year ago. They wanted to front load it on the highest income earners, but now to balance the budget and make sure there's enough revenue to pay for our expenses, they are likely going to raise taxes for everybody. So that I think failed pretty spectacularly because they were about 15%, 10 to 15% short of the votes needed.
We have a couple questions that came in. Do you see them?
I don't.
On the chat.
Oh,
one of them is about the website, and I'm assuming that Ronesh is referring to the website that I provided earlier about the voter fraud. I'm assuming.
The Brennan Center.
Yeah, the Brennan Center. There's besides just the Brennan, that's just one, but there are multiple sites that you could look at that are reliable, that are bipartisan. Because I mean, because even the Trump administration itself also investigated in 2016. Because if you recall, President Trump made the allegation that millions of people voted illegally, and so he had ordered his own Justice Department to investigate it, and they basically came up with the same answer, which is that there was no fraud. So they're kind of all coming up with the same answer. So in this case, I would say that's a pretty reliable source, at least in terms of for this question. And then the next one is, what is the probability that Congress would pass laws about how federal elections should go? For example, ballots, et cetera. Right now it differs by state. And like you said, there's no law that forces a president to concede. I'd argue that there's very little probability of that because it's ultimately up to the states. Kevin, something you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. Other countries just do it differently, where it's part of our federalism where we give states the authority to run the manner of their elections, but in practice, that leads to 10,000 different jurisdictions doing things a little bit uniquely. Now, granted, we have 50 states, but within the states, your local voter precincts may, they're locally run, and the people who are volunteering or in some cases being paid a nominal fee each day might not be following the exact same procedures in another precinct. And so it would be like Canada, Brazil, and other countries that have federal systems still use a nationalized system to make it kind of one size fits all, uniform across the board. I think would make a lot of sense. So maybe if there's enough pushback about irregularities, if they really believe that there's irregularities with this election, that would be a great way to say, okay, well, then let's nationalize a federal election commission to make sure that there's more uniformity across the board. I don't unfortunately see that as being something Republicans are really going to be interested in pursuing.
I would agree. Other questions?
Yeah, there was one about Trump is making the country divisive with his tactics. How can America stop this nonsense and move forward? We can't even talk to the opposing side without yelling. And certainly polarization and conflict on ideology had occurred. It's been part of us since the American experiment started, and it certainly preceded Donald Trump. But I think it's fair to say that it's been exacerbated too in recent years, and certainly with this election. And I have, on Twitter, noticed a lot of calls for unity and for people to talk to somebody who voted differently than they did. And I think sometimes that's the importance of leadership. I mean, it matters for your leader to concede an election. I think that we have to model the attitude and spirit that we would want our citizens to have. And so some people would say it's hard to have unity if you don't even recognize the legitimacy of this election. And, then I see other people talking about, well, you didn't see the legitimacy of President Trump and you tried to impeach him and you called him not our president and so forth. And so I just see a lot of people finding their own arguments to support why they've been wronged and they're the victim. And at some point, this does have to stop and we have to move forward and not just look to the next election and not be looking out for our own partisan interests. And understand the shared humanity that we have, understand the shared problems that we face as a country, and that there's no really way of fully addressing them without working together on the same team. And hopefully there's leadership on both sides to promote that and model that for us.
Yeah, yeah. I would echo what you're saying, absolutely, and also add to that. I think part of the problem, and we were talking about this a few weeks ago too on our last panel, it's hard, I think, for people who are whether you are a Republican who voted for Donald Trump perhaps for financial reasons, or you're a Democrat who voted for Democrat because you always vote Democrat, whatever. I think you can find, if you can agree on sort of a basis of a basic shared reality, it's easier to find consensus. But the problem is now we also have a segment of the population where we cannot even agree on essentially just even a bottom line reality. And we talked about, kind of conspiracy theories before, and how many conspiracy theories have taken root in, like, about a quarter of the country's population now believes in some form of the QAnon conspiracy theory. It's kind of hard to move forward if a big segment of the population believes things like that, because if they believe that Democrats are engaging in child sex trafficking and drinking the blood of children and things of that nature, it's kind of difficult to move forward. That being said, though, that is one, I'd argue, probably a smaller segment of the population. I do think that Biden is what we talked about earlier. It's one of his strengths. People were talking about the fact that he's been around for such a long time as a hindrance, but I'd say in many ways it's actually a strength in this case, because he has developed relations. He's old school, right? He's the kind of guy that's going to pick up the phone to talk to you as opposed to sending you an email or a text, because he understands the importance of developing relationships. So he's had relationships with Mitch McConnell for a long time, and even if they disagree on things, they could backroom get things done. And the idea of backroom does sound kind of shady to people, but that's how things do get done. So I'm hopeful that with his presidency and just kind of lowering the tone, it's not going to be we're not going to be getting this kind of the kerosene on a flame every single day like we were getting before, because that was something that Trump was really good at. He was good at kind of getting. He's a reality TV star, and he I think in many ways treated the presidency as such. So we're not going to be getting that every day. So perhaps I think that in and of itself is going to help lower the divisiveness somewhat. So maybe I'm talking in circles here, but I do think I'm hopeful, and I'm also a little still kind of cynical too at the same time.
I think Democrats need to. I think both parties have opportunities to reflect and improve, and not just about how you can be more competitive to win more seats, but a strategy that's going to work for all Americans. And at least I think we're up to 71 million people have voted for Donald Trump, and several million more than voted for him in 2016. So now, when I say voted for Donald Trump, they selected him on the ballot, and they could have done so for various reasons, but that's the number, that number of people is greater than 71 million people would be like the 20th most populous country in the world. I mean, it's a lot of people to just completely say, well, everything about them is wrong and evil, and I can't agree with them. And then I hear from Democrats, though, that, well, some of the actual policies or ideas or statements that they make don't even acknowledge my own identity. And so, I'm not trying to minimize this in any way. I just am trying to also point out that this is a large segment of the population where, Biden is probably going to have a good 5-6 million more votes nationwide. So there's more people who support him and his vision of America. But we, as political scientists, you have to look at this and see that, there's definitely a huge support for his candidacy, his presidency, and I don't think he's ever got to go away. Obviously he's going to pass away at some point, but I see him being a key figure for the Republican Party going for the next 4 years, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him emerge in 2024 and run again. There's something else I wanted to point out, but I forgot about it, so turn it back over to you, Merri.
Yeah, oh God, 2024 already. I feel like we're going to be talking about, as soon as like the 2021 happens, we're going to start talking already about 2024. No, I would agree. I would agree with what you're saying. I think also the role of social media in all this divisiveness is something that we've not really addressed and talked about too much. And I think that they're starting to address that now, companies like Twitter and Facebook. So if you notice that on many of President Trump's tweets that he was throwing out there, and that disclosure, I have a Twitter account, I'm never on there, so I never look at it, but I know that they were basically issuing disclaimers with some of the comments he was making regarding fraud, which is kind of a first. And I think you saw the same kind of thing even with the role of media, that the media, because they've always sort of been acting in, and even though many of you might be surprised to hear someone say this, they always try to act towards balance. So many times they would not call out things that would happen that were clearly untruths, just because they didn't want to appear to be biased. But just more recently, they have started kind of addressing things. So when President Trump on Saturday or Friday, or I don't even remember now, or Wednesday, I don't even remember what day now, you guys, I'm sorry.
All runs together.
Yeah, they all run together. It's been, like Kevin said, it's been a long week. When he was making certain allegations, and the networks, I think it was Wednesday, they cut away from his briefing. And that's something that you didn't see happen too much before, because they were saying that this is basically what he's saying is false, and he's talking about voter fraud, and there's no proof of voter fraud, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one segment. The social media thing is another. And so I think that you're starting to see these, like, companies like Facebook and Twitter, who are starting to now crack down a little bit more on these sort of, not necessarily censoring them, saying you can't post anything, but now issuing disclaimers alongside them saying, well, this is actually not true. That also being said, I also know that there are other websites that are popping up where that people can go to that are not Facebook, that are not being censored, quote unquote, at all. So, I mean, is this going to just kind of keep going? I think that because this is still such a new medium, that we've not regulated it, because it is still relatively so new. So I think that does play a huge role in how we are viewing one another, right? There's a difference between the Twitter atmosphere and people on the ground. Like, I know a lot of my neighbors have had Trump signs up and they vote for Trump. It doesn't mean I'm not going to get along with them and talk to them, and I'm not going to hate them. But it's easier to hate someone from behind a computer than it is when that person's right in front of you. Over the holidays, it's the same thing, right? You get together, maybe not this year, but you get together with your relatives usually, and you might have relatives that are on the opposite side of the aisle. But it's hard just to say, well, I'm going to write you off completely because you don't believe the way that I believe. So there's a comment on here that I see. I doubt that the millennials and Generation Z generation will allow that to happen. I'm not sure what that. Renisha, can you write a clarification on what you're talking about? Are you talking about like what I said about regulation of Twitter? I'm not sure what the comment's in reference to.
I'm going to interpret that in one way while we wait for her to respond, as one of the things I think is important to point out, that both of these candidates being in their mid to late 70s, I see Biden as a transitional figure. I don't think he runs again in 2024. And maybe Kamala Harris has the lead. I don't want to start thinking about future elections, but I think it's important to think about how these parties are going to go forward. And I think there's splinters within each of they're big tent parties that try to get a big coalition together, and it will be very interesting and pivotal for the future of our country to see how these coalitions, how tightly they stay together in the leadership of the parties, because for the most part, especially on the Democratic side, you have a lot of older leaders between Speaker Pelosi, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and Biden. And I just wanted to point out with Biden, Merri, you mentioned he was old school, and I think it means a lot of different things. But one of the things that used to happen in Congress is they used to like their families would like live near each other and they'd hang out together and they'd have picnics together, and they didn't see, they voted differently, but they didn't see them as like the other team to hate. They actually shared a lot in common and hung out together, and I think that personalization matters. And then there's that. I don't know how to say this delicately enough. It's not my skill suit, but some people have referred to Joe as creepy Joe. He's touchy, he's feely, and I think that he has been. Some of that has been merited, and I think that he should respect boundaries. But I also think there's something about his personality and all the grief that he's gone through, like Merri said, that he is a very empathetic person who I think does try to connect to people. And if you think back to like Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, and some of the other really successful politicians, they had that ability to connect with people. And so I wonder if that's going to be a strength. I wonder if there's going to be a middle ground that he's going to be able to reach with some Republican senators. It's something to keep your eye on.
Yeah. And all you need is a few of them, right? You don't need that many. Even if the Senate stays in Republican hands, which I'm sure it probably will, all we need is a few senators to cross over. So if you've got people like your Mitt Romney and your Ben Sasse who might be willing to do that, or your Susan Collins, there might be some room for some bipartisanship, which I think would just, the tone just has to calm down. The rhetoric just has to be toned down.
Well, that might be, I just read something too, of Senator Manchin, who's a Democrat from West Virginia, said something like, I don't want to misquote him, but I'm not going to let Democrats pass any crazy stuff. If the Democrats get the 2 Georgia seats and they have 50 with Kamala Harris.
Kamala is the tiebreaker.
Yeah, but I mean, you'd have to look at Senator Manchin as the 50th Democrat vote and Kristen Sinema as the 49th. I mean, these are more moderate, centrist Democrats and the Republicans you mentioned. So in essence, those senators could kind of form an alliance and be the kind of group of 8, if you will, that kind of moves us forward and says, they are the 4 kind of middle ground Democrats, 4 middle ground Republicans. And anyway, that's just something to think about. I know there was a question about the pollsters. They have effect on the elections.
And also Renisha clarified, I'm sorry, Kevin, before you go to that one, she clarified that millennials and Generation Z will allow Trump in office again. That's what she was making reference, that they would not elect him again in 2024.
I just would say we could never underestimate Donald Trump because I think he's exceeded expectations in every circumstance that he's been in. And, you just don't know how the next several years are going to play out. But one thing we know is that we're in the midst of a recession. It would be a lot worse if it wasn't for the $3 trillion that the stimulus that passed this summer. So that's essentially gone now. And so I really worry that we're going to have a downward spiral economically. I think this divisiveness of this election, there's the potential for us to not be sitting very well in the next 2 to 4 years. I think we have to be realistic of where we're headed as a country, of the problems that we're facing. And it might be easy for Donald Trump to say, oh, you remember, make America great again. And remember how we were, remember what the economy, remember what the stock market was doing. And so I think that's something we have to be aware of. And as far as the pollsters, I do think that there was an impact that, if you look nationally, there was like a 10% roughly advantage that Biden had over Republican Trump in various states. It looked like Florida and maybe even Texas. It looked like North Carolina that Biden had the advantage. It looked like a lot of Senate seats, Democrats had the advantage. And I think there was an enthusiasm amongst Democrats. I think they were more likely to participate in polls. I think, once again, our polls did not do a good job of identifying the people who are actually going to show up on election day, which is really hard, especially in a pandemic. But it has an impact. I think there was maybe a little complacency on Democrats. Again, I noticed it on various websites and message boards of people like saying, "Oh, Democrats are worrying too much. You know, they're going to win this easily." And I think Republicans use those polling advantages for Democrats to rile up their base and get out the vote. They were, you know, knocking on doors and really spreading the word for Donald Trump. And so I think they really use, you know, they've been kind of an aggrieved party in many ways of showing the media and the pollsters and big tech now, I guess, are all out to get them. And so it's a way of rallying their base to get out the vote. And I think that was helpful for Donald Trump.
Yeah, definitely.
I think he likes to be the underdog.
Yeah, it works for him. Definitely. Do you want me to address a little foreign policy at all, or do we just kind of, because we don't have that much time, or are there more questions?
I don't see any other questions. So
it's up to you. I mean, if you want to
at least start talking about, we can go a few minutes into foreign policy, and if there's final questions, please add them to the chat so we can get them in the final 5 minutes.
It's pretty quick. And can you still see my presentation, Kevin? I forgot to actually undo it. Is it still on there?
Yes.
Okay. Let me just go to this next page here. Just really quick, we were talking about, what did foreign policy look like under Trump? And I think this is an area where he actually had more success, some people would argue, than even domestically, because there were a few things that happened that, the idea of renegotiating NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Israeli peace process, having 3 countries helping to negotiate, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan to recognize Israel, being 3 new countries to recognize Israel, kind of helping to stabilize that region. A couple other things like arms to Ukraine and calling out China for its own unfair trade practices. Those are some of the things that are recognized as some of the good stuff. Now, some of the things that, depending on what side of the aisle you are, you might look at as being, maybe not so good. He's been, I put BFFs, maybe that's not really the right way to say it, but he definitely has shown an affinity for people like Vladimir Putin, who are a bit more dictator-esque in their attitudes towards their own people. I mean, a little flippant, but he definitely likes authoritarianism. And seems to identify with those leaders. Why can't we do that here too, right? Bolsonaro in Brazil is another example. Pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, the World Health Organization, the Iran nuclear deal, anything that seemed to be like a repudiation of things that were from the Obama administration, were things that were withdrawn. We withdrew from. Now, for Joe Biden, obviously, I mean, he's already indicated, just based on the task force that he's put together, that the coronavirus is the number one priority, because nothing else can really happen until that is taken care of. So I think that's already kind of underway. But there are a couple other things that he is indicating that will happen based on some of the recent literature I've read, that the idea of keeping troops. We've had troops stationed in Germany since World War II. Since 1945, and in the Trump administration, they began. I don't think it was completely done, but it was. They had begun to remove those troops. So I think that he'll definitely work to keep those troops there, keep some troops in Afghanistan, try to perhaps renegotiate that deal, the Iran nuclear deal. And I definitely see us, I forgot to add in. I think I had it on there, but maybe it didn't show up. But rejoining the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accords, and perhaps even going further on the Paris Climate Accords, because as recent events have shown, we don't seem to be going far enough. And just overall, just kind of reassuring these allies that we have, in NATO and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, our allies in Europe, that we're still here. We're not going anywhere. We're not going to withdraw and leave you kind of hanging. Perhaps kind of, we'll see what this relationship with Britain looks like, given the Brexit agenda, Brexit still being negotiated with Britain withdrawing from Europe. So there's a lot of interesting things that are going to be happening foreign policy-wise for him, but definitely that's all going to pale in comparison until the coronavirus is under control. There is, let's see, a question. Did you want to add anything on that, Kevin, or comment on any of that?
Well, with the final 5 minutes, I wanted to try to get to a couple other questions that I see in the chat. One I wanted to start with is just I do think it's important to understand like who we are and the positions that our identity, Professor Fefles and I, and we have positions of privilege, and I think sometimes when we talk about forgiveness and when we talk about unity, I can't fully appreciate what everybody is going through with this election, and the various challenges that people are facing and the way that they've been disrespected. And I think each person is going to have to come to their own decision about how to move forward. And I think it's important for us to recognize that too. Do you know what I mean? That
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
Are you referring to the comment on the chat? Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally understand that. Whether you're, depending upon who you are, that you're going to see this election in a unique way, and in that it's going to impact you differently, and that maybe the slights and the things that have happened have just violated your integrity too much to be like, okay, now everything's great, and we're gonna, because you've violated my identity and my core beliefs, and that's too much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would agree. I think, I teach history as well, so I tend to take kind of a wider approach to things. And I think maybe my approach comes from the idea that the rhetoric has gotten so flaming that it feels like it's got to be just drawn down a little bit. And I feel like someone has to be an adult. So if that means that it's got to be, if it starts with Joe Biden. But that being said, I mean, every person is entitled to believe how they want to believe and how they want to look at things. I would argue, though, I don't think that every single person, and I know it's an individual viewpoint, I don't think that anybody who necessarily supports Trump, not every single person is necessarily anti-LGBTQ. I understand how people can view it that way, and I totally get it. But you've had multiple districts that voted for Barack Obama twice that then flipped to Trump. So, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily easy to say that it's simple as that. I think in many cases, it's definitely part of it. I'm not saying it's not the case, but I think it's also sometimes more complex than that. But again, I'm coming at from my point of view. So,
I mean, voters are complicated, and I read a lot of, anecdotes. There was an article in the New York Times interviewing a gentleman who was undocumented, who eventually became a citizen, and his son is 20 years old and is a major Trump supporter and is really enthusiastic about building the wall. And this is the son of an undocumented immigrant, right, who illegally migrated to the United States. So one would think that that's in the wheelhouse of somebody to be voting for Democrat. But, as the article points out, that when you lump categories of voters together, such as Hispanics, there's actually a lot of, variances within this group. And people don't always identify just with this broad umbrella term. And you have to understand there's huge differences within communities, and, that not everybody is going to be voting on the same particular issue. Let's say immigration. People have economic issues. People have, identity issues. So it's very hard to generalize based on groups of voters.
Right, definitely. There's a question also about finding sources, reputable sources, to know about Biden's agenda. We can post some stuff right on here or after.
Yeah, I will find a way to not only that, but the Brennan Center and some of the other we could probably put together your slides and add some of the sources and send that out.
There is an alert that just came on. that the Supreme Court appears ready to uphold the Affordable Health Care Act over the latest challenge from the Trump administration that just came in right now. So interesting. Yeah. Anyway, that's something you might want to look up after this.
Yeah, and I think we still have 30 people here, and I appreciate your time of coming to talk and learn about the 2020 election. We could talk all day about this. It's still, we're still getting results in, and I appreciate all of your contributions. I really want to thank Professor Fefles-Dunkle for sharing her time and expertise again with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you all for coming, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. My email is navratil, Navratil, K2 @morainevalley.edu.